Well, welcome everyone, kia ora koutou, and thank you for joining me here today at the Marsden Point Import Facility. We're hosted today by Channel Infrastructure, who run this facility. I'm here with Rob Buchanan, their leader, and also Grant McCullum, the local MP for Northland. This facility is really important because it's where ships come filled with petrol, diesel and jet fuel for New Zealand. It's one of several facilities across the country, although this is the largest facility for importing fuel into New Zealand. What you can see behind me is the Torm Herdis. It's one of the largest tankers that New Zealand can receive, and it's filled with around a week's worth of petrol, diesel and jet fuel to meet New Zealand's needs. Ships like these regularly come to New Zealand, and the updates that we've been giving you as a government can assure New Zealanders that together with our minimum stock holding obligations, which we place on fuel importing countries, together across storage in the country already, and fuel that's on boats coming here, we remain in a position where we have at least 7 weeks of fuel security for New Zealand. Of course, all of that is dependent on ships like this continuing to turn up. At this point, we can continue to advise you that they're turning up as expected, filled with the fuel that is expected. And what I'm here today to do is to talk to Channel Infrastructure about their operations, to understand it better, to understand what we would expect to see if there were going to be any challenges in the New Zealand fuel security pipeline. And so with that, I'm very happy to take any of your questions.
So Australia has confirmed that 6 tanker shipments that were due next month have been cancelled or deferred. Are we seeing anything similar in New Zealand?
We're not at this stage. I understand that in Australia's case, some of what you're reporting is to do with delays in ships arriving. And that is the sort of disruption that we are anticipating and getting ready for. And that's because globally we know there's been a massive disruption to both oil getting to refineries and therefore disruption at ports. So it is not inconceivable that there will be delays of days in some case between when we were scheduling ships to arrive and when they are arriving. We don't have specific reports of that sort for New Zealand, but it is one of the things that we're anticipating as we think about the scenarios that New Zealand needs to be positioned strongly for.
What sort of impacts are we going to see because of those delays, potential delays?
Yeah, well, as I say, we're not seeing them yet, but were we to experience those delays, that's why we have these minimum stock holding obligations in New Zealand. What they essentially are is saying anyone who wants to sell fuel in New Zealand needs to have a buffer, a reserve of fuel ready in case there are delays in fuel getting into the country. And so we have that safety buffer, as it were, for precisely this reason, to allow for the fact that there could be disruption in global supply chains and we don't want to be caught short. I'd note that our minimum reserve obligations are bigger than those in Australia, which means that we are in a relatively stronger position in that sense. But it's also the case that we wouldn't expect to be running into those buffers anytime soon, because across our fuel importing companies, they are holding more than the minimum required. And you can see that in the data that we've been publishing. You can see that they're holding on average around 7 weeks worth of fuel. To remind you, our minimum stock holding obligations are 28 days worth of petrol, 24 days worth of jet fuel, 21 days worth of diesel. And right now across the country, together with that in the country and on its way, there's more fuel than that. So we are in a position where we've got good reserves, a good safety buffer.
And those companies are confident that they can keep those reserves intact?
They remain confident at this stage, but the reason we are working with them on a daily basis is because they, like us, can anticipate that global supply chains are of course impacted by what's happening in the Middle East and the Strait of Hormuz and the access of oil into the refineries. And so we want to have an early heads up from them if they're seeing disruption. In the first instance, if they were seeing disruption, that might mean delays. In the second instance, it might mean that they need to source fuel from other locations in the world. In any event, we would want to have very good forewarning so that we could plan for any extra steps the government may need to take.
How confident can we be that ships like the one behind you will continue to come in regularly?
Well, we are confident right now that ships are still scheduled to arrive in the coming days. Several ships are scheduled to arrive in the coming weeks, and that remains something that we're confident of. As we look to the future, we can expect that fuel importing companies will continue to secure orders for more fuel for the months ahead. Were they to face delays in those arrivals or disruptions, they would try and source fuel from elsewhere to meet demand here in New Zealand. And we as a government are working alongside them to consider whether there are extra things we can do to support that effort, whether that might be widening the range of fuel specifications for fuel that they can import into New Zealand, and as another set of measures, whether we would need to consider anything else in New Zealand to prioritise who fuel goes to and when.
I spoke to somebody on the way here who was quite anxious about the situation, understandably, seeing the prices at the fuel pump continue to climb. She told me she felt that the government was almost too relaxed about the situation. How do you respond to that?
Absolutely, we are not relaxed, we are vigilant and alert. And the first thing I would just say to every New Zealander is I know this is having a significant impact on you already. Those prices at the pump are hard to take, and I recognise it's putting a lot of pressure on people's budgets already. And the sad reality is a conflict in the Middle East, which New Zealand is not a part of, is already creating pain for Kiwis in their everyday lives. We can see that, we are witnessing that. Our first responsibility is to ensure that New Zealanders do continue to have the fuel they need. That's partly why I'm here today, to say that those numbers we're updating you with of the 7 weeks worth of fuel, it's not just a number on a page, it's real tankers turning up to real storage facilities where we have reserves of fuel. And that means you're not just relying on what's stored at your local petrol station, you can also be confident that there's fuel in storage and fuel on its way. It's our job to be prepared for what could be disruption, and we are very alert, very ready, working with industry to make sure that New Zealand is protected.
Are you any closer to determining who your relief package might be targeting?
Well, we have a discussion that we will have as Cabinet Ministers about that, and I've been candid that my initial focus is on those low to middle income households who are working. As workers, in many cases, people don't have a choice but to travel to work each day. And I'm also always focused on families with children, because I know not only do they often face the highest household budget costs, but they also are the people who can suffer the most when the cost of living spikes, as it has in relation to the Middle East crisis.
Will single people be excluded, seeing as there is this focus?
Well, obviously we have a lot of discussions to be had, but in the first instance, I know that every New Zealander wants us to ensure that we have fuel security in the country. The reason that matters is fuel drives our economy. It supports jobs, it supports incomes. So in our efforts to ensure we have adequate fuel supply, we're focused on the economic needs of every single Kiwi. In the second instance, we have a job to do to protect Kiwis from inflation, that is cost rises, being more than needs to be the case. And we need to be very measured, because if our government spends too much on relief packages, we could inadvertently drive up inflation and price increases across the economy. I need to look Kiwis in the eye and say that I'm going to take great care not to do that. We also need to recognise that even in crisis, there is no emergency money available to New Zealand. The international cost of borrowing has risen considerably since this crisis began, and it's our job as a government to ensure New Zealand remains resilient, and that means that we have to keep up an approach of being careful, targeted and temporary in terms of any support we offer.
What's the earliest that could come in, whoever is going to receive it?
Well, Cabinet will have a range of options. We're looking towards solutions that could be implemented quickly, could be implemented ahead of the budget, and could be implemented in a way that we can have assurance it'll reach the people we want in the time that we want.
Any further thought to cuts to fuel tax?
Well, the problem with doing that is twofold. First, in a situation where we may be having to manage fuel supply, the advice from our officials is it wouldn't make sense to do an across-the-board cut. We're very mindful that could cost potentially billions of dollars, but would not be targeted. It would end up benefiting New Zealanders from across the income spectrum, when actually we know there are some Kiwis who are going to be particularly hard hit, and they're the ones who we should focus financial support on in the first instance.
If the advice changes, will you be following that advice?
The advice is very clear that there are better ways of providing support to New Zealanders than just doing a blanket fuel price cut. In particular, I think New Zealanders will understand this, that income straight to people that they then can make choices about is better than just discounting one form of transport. Conscious that many New Zealanders are already reacting to the petrol price by choosing to take public transport, by choosing to walk, by choosing to carpool, and Auckland Transport have reported the biggest patronage of their public service network in 7 years, and what that shows you is that Kiwis will make different choices depending on their own family's circumstance.
Any targeted relief for rural communities that can't perhaps take public transport or who need diesel generators to run their businesses?
Yeah, very mindful of rural communities. The fuel that is most important to rural New Zealand is diesel. And the reason diesel matters is because it's not only what powers our freight, which gets the milk in the tanker to the factory and gets the milk powder from the factory to the port. Diesel is also the fuel used for farm machinery and for many workers in rural communities. So that's why we, in our approach to this crisis, are focusing on each fuel separately: diesel, petrol and jet fuel, and we're looking particularly at diesel as an area where we know that if we were to have any fuel insecurity, that could be very disruptive to our rural economy, but our economy more broadly.
Just a question from down the line. Have you had any ships carrying fuel to New Zealand cancelled yet?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
I know we're talking about petrol a lot, but just based on your rural comments, is it possible to just target any tax relief to diesel?
Well, again, the challenge with doing that would be that providing a lower price for diesel wouldn't solve a supply problem. In the first instance, what we want to do is make sure we have enough diesel, and so changing the tax wouldn't actually increase the supply of diesel into the country. And so what we're very focused on is making sure we've got enough diesel, not just now, but into the coming weeks and months to fuel our economy. That's really important. If we don't have enough supply of diesel, that could affect thousands upon thousands of jobs and incomes. So that's the first thing, the first priority for diesel.
And what about some relief of road user charges? Could that perhaps be a solution?
Well, again, we need to be careful that any solution we offer is temporary and targeted, and our focus is on making sure that we're protecting fuel security for all. That's a universal need for all New Zealanders, and then in a second sense, considering what very targeted measures we can deliver in a way that's also economically responsible.
Would those RUC changes affect that though?
Well, RUC changes again would be universal and would affect even those on the highest incomes. The most profitable businesses would benefit when we know that there are some groups in the community who are going to be harder hit by this crisis. So where we are using taxpayer money to offer support, we need to make sure it's going where it's needed most. Great. I noticed Rob didn't get to say anything. Is there anything you want to say about this facility or what goes on here?
Well, look, from Channel's perspective, all right, sorry. From Channel's perspective, nothing has changed, essentially. We operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We have ships like this come in every week. The ships are continuing to come in as scheduled and as expected, and we have over 300 million litres of storage on our site, and again with storage in tanks that is absolutely consistent with those figures that MB's putting out. So no change from us. We continue to be a resilient operator and doing our job well.
Is there a need to increase storage here?
Well, that's a matter for government and the fuel companies, not Channel. We obviously have a lot of ex-crude tanks from the old refinery, but that's something we can talk about in due course.
Can you easily increase storage capacity here?
Well, actually, since the refinery closed, we've brought on stream about 100 million litres of additional storage, and we have a jet tank which we're putting the finishing touches on that I expect to be finished in the next 6 months. that will hold about the equivalent of 10,000 flights between Auckland and Wellington, so very, very large tank. So yes, we've absolutely been bringing on more storage.
The ships are still coming in as scheduled. Are they still at the same capacity as scheduled as well? Nothing's changed?
Nothing's changed.
I know we've sort of touched on it already, but can you give me an idea of the scale of the ship behind you, how much fuel it's bringing in, how often these kinds of ships come in?
Sure. So the vessel behind me is an LR2 class vessel. She's sailed from Singapore. She can hold up to around 125 or 130 million litres of fuel. To put that in perspective, our whole facility is around 300 million litres of fuel. So these are the largest ships that come to New Zealand. You can see she's sitting low in the water, which means she's very full of fuel.
And that's about a week's worth?
That's right.
How are your stock levels looking here? Is that just fully going to replenish what you've lost here? Or?
That's right. So that's the way the system works, and our stock levels are basically consistent with those being reported by MB.
Yeah, and I'd note that the government has already regulated to ensure that in the future New Zealand fuel companies will have to hold more diesel in the country, and so that is an obligation that we have created.